had become harsh and unpredictable, and survival was never guaranteed. Every day was a challenge, and every journey outside the settlement carried a risk. Yet Daniel never shied away from danger. He knew that if someone did not take the risk, the community would not last long. That morning, when he volunteered to travel into the wasteland to search for lost supplies, he knew it would not be easy, but he did not hesitate. The wasteland was not a place many humans dared to go. Rumors spread about alien patrols, creatures that lurked in the sandstorms, and sudden landslides that could trap a person forever. The land itself seemed alive, unpredictable and merciless. But Daniel had learned to read the signs of the land. He noticed the shifting winds, the cracks in the ground, and the way the rocks leaned as if waiting to fall. Even so, danger could strike at any moment. His heart beat steady but firm as he carried his small pack, with nothing more than a flask of water, some dried food, and his will to make it through. As the hours passed, the wasteland tested him. The heat rose from the cracked ground, making every step heavier than the last. The sun glared down, forcing him to shield his eyes with his arm. Sweat ran down his back, and his throat begged for more water than he could spare. But he kept moving. Each step forward was not for himself, but for the people waiting back home. Children who needed food, elders who needed medicine, and families who hoped he would return with something to keep them alive a little longer. It was during this lonely walk across the wasteland that Daniel heard something unusual. At first, he thought it was just the wind whistling through the broken rocks. But then he heard it again, a sound like a faint cry. He froze in place, his instincts sharpened. In a place like this, any sound could mean danger. He crouched low, scanning the rocks around him, expecting to see movement from an alien patrol or a wild creature. But instead he saw a small shape, near a cluster of fallen stones. His heart tightened when he realized what it was. A child, though not a human child, lay trapped beneath heavy debris. The rocks must have fallen recently, because dust still hung in the air. Her skin had a faint glow, different from anything Daniel had ever seen, and her eyes shimmered faintly even in the daylight. She was clearly one of them, an alien. Her kind had long been seen as enemies by his people. Stories of battles, raids, and mistrust filled the history between their worlds. Many humans would have turned away, convincing themselves it was not their problem. Some might even have felt a cruel satisfaction at seeing an enemy's child in such a state. But Daniel did not think that way. What he saw was not an enemy, but a helpless child, terrified and struggling to breathe. He rushed forward without a second thought. The rocks were heavy, and lifting them drained what little strength he had left, but he pushed on. His arms ached, and sweat dripped into his eyes, blinding him, yet he kept pulling stone after stone away. Each time he managed to free a piece, the child whimpered softly, and that sound alone fueled his determination. "Hold on," he whispered, even though he knew she might not understand his language. His voice was calm, steady, like a promise that he would not leave her. Finally, with one last heave, Daniel freed the last large rock pinning her legs. The child gasped and tried to move, but she was too weak. Carefully, Daniel lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, fragile, as if one wrong move could break her. Her glowing eyes opened slightly, and she looked at him with a mix of fear and hope. Her lips moved, and though the words were faint and strange, he caught enough to understand. "Help. Mom." That one word, "Mom," hit Daniel deeply. She was not just a child of another species, not just a stranger in the wasteland. She was someone's daughter, lost and desperate to return to her mother. He thought about the people back home, about the children in his settlement who cried for their mothers when they were hurt. The feeling was the same, no matter the world or race. Daniel took a sip from his own water flask and gently touched it to her lips. At first she hesitated, unsure if she could trust him. But then, with trembling hands, she accepted the water. Her breathing slowed, and her eyes softened. For the first time, he saw something more than fear in her gaze. He saw trust beginning to form. He knew then that he could not leave her. It did not matter that she was alien, or that helping her might put him in danger. What mattered was that she was a child and she needed someone, and right now he was the only one there for her. Daniel looked toward the mountains far ahead, their jagged peaks cutting into the sky. She had pointed in that direction, her weak hand trembling as she tried to guide him. That must be where her people lived. The thought of walking all that distance, carrying her in his arms, through storms and unknown dangers made his muscles ache even before he started. But he did not let the doubt stay. He adjusted her gently in his arms, securing her so she would not fall. "Don't worry," he said softly. "I'll take you home." The wasteland stretched endlessly before him, but Daniel took the first step without hesitation. The girl rested her head against his shoulder, her small hand gripping his shirt as if she feared he might vanish. He felt the weight of responsibility settle on him, not a burden but a purpose. He was no longer walking only for his people back home. He was walking for her too. As the day faded into evening, the heat gave way to biting cold. The wasteland did not forgive easily, but Daniel kept moving, his steps steady, his mind focused. He could feel the child's faint breaths against his neck, reminding him that her life depended on his strength. Every time he stumbled, he thought of her mother, somewhere beyond those mountains, waiting without knowing if her daughter was alive. That thought gave him the power to rise again, to keep walking no matter how heavy his legs became. The wasteland was cruel, but in that moment, Daniel carried with him something stronger than fear, stronger than exhaustion. He carried hope, not just his own, but the hope of a child who believed he could save her. And with each step forward, the bond between them silently grew, unspoken yet unbreakable, setting the stage for what neither of them could yet imagine, a meeting that would change both their worlds forever. Daniel's legs burned as he trudged through the wasteland, the little girl resting in his arms. The sun had begun to sink lower in the sky, painting the cracked earth with long shadows. Every step felt heavier, and his throat felt dry as if he had swallowed sand. But he didn't stop. The child's soft breathing against his chest reminded him of the promise he had made, to bring her home. At times he shifted her gently, trying to give his tired arms some relief. Her small hand still clung to his shirt, as though she feared that if she let go, she might be lost again. Daniel glanced at her face from time to time. Though she was weak, there was a quiet strength in her glowing eyes. She trusted him now. And that trust was a weight heavier than any stone he had lifted. He could not fail her. The wasteland stretched on endlessly, silent except for the sound of wind whistling between the jagged rocks. The silence felt unnatural. Daniel had grown up hearing stories of raiders, of alien scouts who attacked wandering humans. The thought of being discovered carried a sharp edge of fear, but he pushed it down. Fear wouldn't help him. All he could do was focus on moving forward. When the sun dipped lower, Daniel knew he had to find a place to rest. He scanned the horizon until he spotted a cluster of rocks forming a small hollow. It wasn't much, but it would give them shelter from the cold night winds. He carefully carried the girl inside and laid her down on a patch of soft sand. She stirred, her lips moving as if to speak. He leaned closer, listening. Her words were broken, foreign, but one thing was clear. She was calling for her mother again. Daniel's heart tightened. He brushed the dust from her face and whispered, "I'll get you there, don't give up." Even if she didn't understand his words, perhaps she could feel the comfort in his voice. From his pack, he took out the little water he had left. He drank only a sip before holding the flask to her lips again. She drank weakly, but her eyes softened with gratitude. He gave her a piece of dried bread too, though he doubted she had ever tasted human food before. She chewed slowly, carefully, as if trying to understand its strange flavor. Daniel smiled faintly. At least she was eating. Night fell quickly, and with it came the biting cold. Daniel pulled his worn jacket around them both, holding her close, to share his body heat. The stars above glittered brightly, endless and strange. Somewhere out there was her home, her people, and her mother, waiting without knowing if her daughter still breathed. The thought filled Daniel with a determination he had never felt before. As the child drifted into sleep, Daniel stayed awake. His eyes scanned the darkness, ears sharp for any sound. He had learned long ago that danger always came when least expected, and sure enough, as the wind carried sand across the hollow, he heard it, a low growl. Daniel froze, tightening his hold on the girl. Out of the shadows, a creature emerged, its body low to the ground, its eyes glowing faintly. It looked like a cross between a wolf and a reptile built for speed and hunting. Another growl sounded, and a second creature appeared beside the first. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. He had no weapon, only a small knife that would barely scratch them. He shifted slightly, keeping himself between the child and the approaching beasts. The creatures circled slowly, their eyes fixed on him. Daniel shouted, waving his arms to make himself look bigger, his voice echoing through the hollow. For a moment, the beasts hesitated. Then one lunged. Instinct took over. Daniel kicked, up sand with his foot, throwing it into the creature's face. The beast snarled, backing off. He grabbed a loose rock and hurled it at the second one. The rock struck its shoulder, and it let out a furious screech. For minutes that felt like hours, Daniel fought to keep them at bay, yelling, throwing stones, and holding his ground. His throat burned from shouting, his arms ached, but he did not step back. The beasts finally gave a frustrated growl before retreating into the night. Daniel's chest heaved as he dropped to his knees, exhausted. His arms trembled from the fight, but when he looked at the girl still asleep, unaware of how close danger had come, his exhaustion turned into relief. He leaned back against the rocks, whispering to himself, "Not tonight, not while I'm here." Morning came with a pale light creeping across the wasteland. Daniel woke stiff and sore, but alive. The child stirred too, her eyes opening slowly. She looked at him with a question in her gaze, as if asking how he had kept her safe. He smiled tiredly, brushing her hair back from her forehead. "We made it through the night." They set out again, Daniel carrying her as they followed the direction she had pointed toward before, the mountains in the distance. The journey was slow, every step draining his strength. Sometimes, when the path allowed, he set her down gently so he could rest. She would sit quietly, watching him with those glowing eyes, her small hands fidgeting with the edge of his jacket. Then when he lifted her again, she would rest her head on his shoulder, as if she had decided he was safe enough to carry her wherever she needed to go. The days blurred together, heat by day, cold by night. Hunger gnawed at Daniel's stomach, and his water ran low. Yet he gave most of what he had to the child, taking only what he needed to stay on his feet. He thought of his people back home, of how they would shake their heads if they saw him giving so much to an alien child. But he knew he was doing the right thing. Right and wrong did not depend on race or blood. They depended on choice. And Daniel had chosen to protect her. On the third night, as they rested by a dry riverbed, the girl surprised him. She sat up slowly, her voice weak but clearer than before. She tried to speak his language, repeating words she must have picked up from him. "You, safe?" Daniel blinked in surprise. He had not expected her to learn so quickly. He nodded, smiling. "Yes, safe." She smiled faintly back, and for the first time, her laughter, soft and musical, filled the night air. It was a sound so pure that Daniel felt his heart lighten. In that moment, he realized something important. This journey was no longer about obligation. It wasn't just about helping a stranger's child. Somewhere along the way, she had become more than that. She had become his responsibility, his companion, and in a strange way, his hope. The mountains grew larger with each passing day. Their sharp peaks stood like guardians against the horizon, a promise that the journey had an end. But reaching them would not be easy. Daniel knew that the closer they came to alien territory, the greater the danger would be. Yet every time doubt crept into his mind, he felt the child's small hand grip his shirt or heard her soft voice whisper, "Safe." and it gave him the strength to keep going. Through storms, hunger, and the constant threat of danger, Daniel walked on. He did not know what awaited him at the end of the path. He did not know if the aliens would welcome him or strike him down the moment they saw him. But one thing was clear. He would not stop until he placed the child back into her mother's arms. And so, step by step, under the burning sun and the freezing stars, the human and the alien child journeyed together. Strangers at first, bound only by chance, now connected by trust and the silent promise that they would see this journey through. Neither knew it yet, but their story was about to reach a moment that would change both of their lives forever. The mountains loomed closer with every passing day, their jagged peaks rising high into the sky like silent watchmen. Daniel's body was exhausted, every muscle aching, but the sight of those mountains filled him with hope. The girl he carried pointed toward them again and again, her small glowing eyes lighting up each time she saw the peaks. It was clear. That was where her home was, and it was where her mother was waiting. Daniel knew that reaching the mountains meant danger. He wasn't walking into empty land anymore. The closer he got, the more signs of alien life he saw. Strange markings carved into stones, broken weapons half buried in the sand, and structures that didn't look natural. Sometimes at night he even saw faint lights flickering far in the distance, moving in patterns that could only belong to patrols. He stayed cautious, always finding hidden paths through rocks and gullies, determined not to be spotted too soon. Child trusted him completely now. She no longer looked afraid when he carried her. At times she tried to walk beside him, though her steps were unsteady and her legs still weak from her injuries. When she stumbled, Daniel caught her, and she would give him a tired but determined smile. She was strong in her own way, and that gave Daniel even more reason not to give up. Finally, after days of struggle, Daniel stood at the edge of the alien stronghold. He hadn't known what to expect, but the sight before him was unlike anything he could have imagined. Enormous towers rose from the ground, built from a material that shimmered like crystal yet looked as strong as iron. Pathways wound between them, glowing faintly with light that pulsed like veins. The air itself felt different, filled with energy that made his skin prickle. His steps slowed as he approached, the child resting in his arms once again. His heart pounded. He knew he was risking everything by walking into their world. If the guards decided he was a threat, he wouldn't stand a chance. Still, he didn't stop. He couldn't. He looked down at the girl. She was watching the towers with wide eyes, her face filled with hope. That hope was enough to push him forward. Before long, shadows moved at the gates of the stronghold. Figures emerged, alien guards, tall and imposing, their armor gleaming, their weapons glowing with strange energy. Their eyes narrowed the moment they saw Daniel. With sharp, practiced movements, they raised their weapons, forming a wall between him and the entrance. Daniel froze, holding the child tighter. He had expected this, but facing it was still terrifying. The guards shouted in their language, their voices harsh and commanding. Though he couldn't understand the words, their meaning was clear. Stop. Do not come closer. He swallowed hard, unsure of what to do. Slowly, carefully, he knelt down and set the girl on her feet, hoping it would show he meant no harm. The guards didn't lower their weapons. They moved forward, ready to strike if he took another step. Daniel raised his hands, palms open, showing he carried no weapon. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the girl suddenly cried out. Her voice, weak but urgent, echoed through the air. The words she spoke were clear to the guards, though Daniel could not understand them fully. All he heard was her voice breaking with emotion as she called out, "Mom!" The effect was immediate. The guards faltered, exchanging quick glances. Their weapons wavered, and confusion spread across their faces. One of them spoke sharply and another turned toward the towers, shouting something that carried deep authority. Moments later, the air seemed to shift. A presence approached, powerful and commanding. The guards straightened, their heads bowing, slightly as if in respect. From within the shimmering gates, a tall figure emerged, her steps graceful, yet heavy with authority. Daniel's breath caught in his chest. He didn't need to be told who she was. This was the alien queen. She was unlike anything he had ever seen. Her form was tall and regal, her movements fluid like flowing water, and her eyes glowed with an intensity that seemed to pierce through everything. Her presence was overwhelming, not just because of her beauty, but because of the strength she carried. Around her, silence fell. Even the guards who had shouted moments before lowered their weapons and stepped aside. The child's eyes lit up, and with a burst of energy she hadn't shown before, she ran forward. "Mom!" she cried again, her small arms reaching out. The queen's eyes widened. She bent swiftly, gathering her daughter into her arms. For a moment, all the power, all the authority she carried softened into something far simpler: love. She held her child close, whispering words Daniel couldn't understand but recognized all the same. Words of comfort, of relief, of a mother, reunited with her daughter. Then the child turned in her mother's arms and pointed back toward Daniel. Her voice, though tired, rang out clearly. "Mom, he saved me." Every guard froze. The queen slowly raised her gaze toward Daniel. Her eyes locked on him, sharp and unreadable. The weight of her stare pressed on him like a mountain. He felt small, exposed, standing there with nothing but his empty hands. For a long moment, no one spoke. The queen's expression shifted slowly. Confusion, suspicion, then something else, something softer. She looked down at her daughter again, who clung to her tightly and repeated, "He saved me." The queen's jaw tightened. She stood tall, her daughter still in her arms, and addressed her guards in a voice that echoed with authority. The guards hesitated but obeyed, lowering their weapons. Their eyes remained fixed on Daniel, filled with distrust, but they no longer threatened to strike. Daniel let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief flooded him, though he stayed perfectly still, not daring to move. His eyes flicked to the child, who gave him a small smile from the safety of her mother's embrace. In that moment, Daniel knew his journey had reached its turning point. He had brought the girl home. But what came next, he did not know. He stood in the heart of enemy territory, surrounded by those who had every reason to see him as a threat. The only thing protecting him now were the words of a child, words spoken with innocence but carrying more power than any weapon. "Mom, he saved me." The queen studied him in silence, the weight of her decision hanging in the air. Whether he would leave this place alive or not depended on her next words. The alien queen stood tall, her presence filling the entire courtyard. Her long robe shimmered under the glowing light of the towers, and the guards bowed slightly, waiting for her command. Yet her eyes did not leave Daniel. They held a mixture of emotions, suspicion, gratitude, and something far deeper that was hard to name. The child clung tightly to her mother, her glowing eyes wet with tears. She buried her face against the queen's chest, whispering in her own language. The queen's expression softened each time her daughter spoke. Yet when her gaze returned to Daniel, it hardened again, like steel. Daniel remained still, his hands raised slightly, showing he meant no harm. He could feel the tension in the air. The guards were waiting for a single word from their queen to strike him down. He had no weapon, no strength left to fight. His only shield was the truth of what had happened. The queen finally spoke, her voice low but powerful. The words were in her language, but her tone was clear. She was questioning him. Daniel wished he could answer, but they shared no tongue. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, frustrated. How could he explain? How could he make them see? The child pulled at her mother's robe, pointing again at Daniel. Her small voice rose in protest. "Mom, he saved me," she repeated. She tugged harder, desperate to make her mother believe. The queen listened, her eyes narrowing slightly. She turned to one of the guards, who stepped forward and spoke quickly. Perhaps he was translating, or perhaps he was giving his own opinion. Daniel couldn't know for sure, but he saw the queen lift her hand to silence the guard. Then, with surprising grace, the queen walked closer to Daniel. The air seemed to thrum with energy as she approached. She stopped just a few steps away, her daughter still in her arms. For a moment, she simply looked at him. Her gaze swept over his dirt-stained clothes, his exhausted face, the way he swayed slightly from weakness yet stood tall. Daniel slowly lowered his hands and placed one over his chest. He bowed his head slightly, not in submission, but in respect. He didn't know if she would understand the gesture, but it was the only way he could show that he had no ill intentions. The Queen studied him a moment longer, then spoke a single word. Instantly, the guards lowered their weapons completely, though their expressions stayed wary. Daniel let out a long breath of relief. He was not safe, not yet, but he was not going to die at that moment. The Queen gestured and 2 guards stepped forward. Daniel stiffened, worried they might seize him, but instead they moved beside him, motioning for him to follow. The Queen turned and began walking toward the great towers, her daughter still holding on to her tightly. Daniel hesitated only a second before following. As they entered the stronghold, Daniel could not help but stare. The alien city was breathtaking. Structures glowed softly, alive with light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Pathways wound gracefully around gardens filled with plants that shimmered faintly in the air. Strange creatures, harmless and beautiful, floated lazily above pools of water that reflected the glowing towers. But as stunning as it all was, Daniel never forgot where he was. This was the heart of their power. He was the outsider, the intruder. At any moment, a single order could end him. They were led into a great hall, its walls glittering with shifting patterns of light. The Queen sat on a raised platform, her daughter beside her. Daniel was guided to the center of the hall, where he stood surrounded by guards. The Queen's eyes never left him. She spoke again, her voice filling the hall. Daniel could not understand her words, but he understood the meaning. She was asking for the truth. Daniel thought hard. He needed to show her what had happened. Slowly, carefully, he knelt down and touched the ground with one hand, then lifted imaginary rocks with the other, mimicking the way he had freed her daughter. He then placed a hand over his chest and pointed at the girl. His eyes pleaded with the Queen to understand. I saved her because it was the right thing to do. The hall fell silent. The Queen watched him closely. Her daughter, however, jumped up and ran to Daniel, tugging at his sleeve. Safe, she said in broken human words, her voice clear. He's safe. The Queen's eyes widened slightly. She turned to her daughter, shocked at the words. The girl repeated them louder this time. He's safe. She pressed her hand to her chest, then pointed at Daniel, mimicking his earlier gesture. For the first time, Daniel saw the Queen's stern expression soften. She reached out and touched her daughter's cheek, then slowly turned her gaze back to him. There was still suspicion in her eyes, but there was also something else, an acknowledgement. The guards shifted uneasily, whispering among themselves. Some looked angry, others confused. To them, Daniel was still an enemy, no matter what he had done. But the Queen lifted her hand, silencing them all. Her voice rang through the hall as she declared something with firm authority. Daniel didn't know the words, but he understood the meaning from the way the guards lowered their heads in reluctant obedience. She was sparing him. Relief washed over him, but he also felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about his survival anymore. By sparing him, the Queen had made a choice that could shift the fragile balance between their peoples. The Queen looked at him one last time, her gaze steady and unreadable. She had made her decision, but what it meant for the future was still uncertain. That night, as Daniel sat alone in a small chamber the aliens had given him, he thought of the journey that had brought him here. He had carried a child across the wasteland, fought against beasts, hunger, and exhaustion, only to find himself in the heart of the alien stronghold, and yet somehow he was still alive. The memory of the child's voice echoed in his mind. Mom, he saved me. Those words had saved his life. But Daniel knew the story was far from over. Days passed inside the alien stronghold, and Daniel remained under constant watch. Guards followed his every step, their eyes sharp with suspicion. He was not a prisoner, yet he was not free either. He was caught between two worlds, welcomed by none but needed by one. The child often visited him. She would slip into his chamber, her steps quick and light, her glowing eyes bright with joy. Each time she came, she tried to learn more of his words. She pointed at objects, waiting for him to name them. Slowly, her vocabulary grew. "Water," she would say, holding up a cup. "Safe," she would repeat proudly whenever she saw him. Her laughter filled the room, a sound that gave Daniel strength even in his uncertainty. The queen, too, watched him closely. She attended to her duties as ruler, but Daniel could feel her eyes on him whenever they crossed paths in the halls. She spoke little to him, but her gaze carried questions. Why had he risked his life for her daughter? Why had a human shown mercy when so many others had not? One evening, the queen summoned him to the great hall again. This time, the gathering was larger. Advisors, warriors, and elders stood in rows, their expressions stern. Daniel stood in the center, feeling every eye upon him. The queen rose, her daughter at her side. She spoke in her language, her voice calm but strong. The hall echoed with murmurs. Daniel could not understand the words, but he could see the debate unfolding around him. Some faces were angry, others doubtful, a few even curious. The child tugged at her mother's robe, then stepped forward. In a small but clear voice, she spoke in broken human words. "He safe. He good. He helped me." The hall fell silent. All eyes turned to the child. Her innocence carried more weight than any argument. She looked around the room, her small hand pointing at Daniel. "He saved me," she repeated. The queen placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder and spoke again, her tone final. The advisors fell silent, their protests swallowed by the authority in her voice. Daniel realized then what she had done. She had declared him under her protection. Whatever their people thought of him, they could not harm him. From that day forward, Daniel's life inside the stronghold changed. He was no longer just a stranger. He was treated with cautious respect, given food, and a place to stay. The child visited him daily, and sometimes the queen herself would sit nearby, listening as her daughter struggled to form human words. Though she rarely spoke to Daniel, her silence no longer felt hostile. It felt thoughtful, as if she was trying to understand him. Slowly, Daniel began to feel a shift. The walls of suspicion started to thin. He was not seen as just an enemy anymore. He was something else, something new. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, the queen approached him alone. Her daughter played nearby, her laughter echoing softly. The queen studied him for a long moment before speaking, her words slow and careful. She used her daughter's limited human vocabulary to bridge the gap. "Why?" she asked. Daniel understood the question. Why had he saved the child? He thought for a moment, then placed a hand over his heart. "Because she is a child," he said simply. "Because it was right." The queen's eyes searched his face. She seemed to weigh his words, testing them. Finally, she nodded slightly, as if she had found the answer she needed. From then on, something shifted between them. She no longer looked at him as just a human intruder. She began to see him as a man who had risked his life not for gain, not for power, but out of kindness. And that made him dangerous in a different way. Not because he was a threat, but because he was a possibility. The possibility of peace. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel's presence in the stronghold became a quiet symbol. The story of the human who had saved the queen's daughter spread. Some doubted it, some resisted it, but no one could deny it. Wherever he walked, whispers followed. The queen never said it aloud, but Daniel knew. She saw him now as more than just a stranger. She saw him as a bridge between her people and his. And though he had never asked for such a role, Daniel accepted it. Because when he remembered the child's words spoken with such innocence and trust, "Mom, he saved me," he knew that sometimes the choices of one person could change the fate of many. And so the story of a tired human and a lost alien child became something greater. The story of two worlds beginning to see each other not as enemies but as family.